John Dewey, philosopher, social reformer, and educator, by Renteria, South Dakota State University. John Dewey was a renowned American philosopher, social reformer, and educator. He had a significant impact on education. He felt that the greatest education was simply learned by doing, which is still used and said by educators today. Some famous quotes by John Dewey. All genuine learning comes through experience. The most important attitude that can be formed is that of a desire to go on learning. Give the pupil something to do, not something to learn. In the doing is of such of nature as to demand thinking. Learning naturally results. We do not learn from experience, we learn from reflecting on experience. John Dewy lived from 1859 to 1952. He was the third son of four others of his parents, Archibald Dewey and Luciana Rich of Burlington, Vermont. The oldest of four brothers, John Dewey passed away in 1859, leaving three brothers: Davis Dewey, Charles Dewey, and John Dewey himself. Being the wealthy farmer's daughter, Dewey's mother was raised as a Calvinist. As for Dewey's father, in order to enlist in the Union Army and fight for the Civil War, he quit his food business. During the war, Archibald found his love for British literature, relaying that to his children often. Following the war, Dewey's father went on to run a tobacco shop, which in turn provided his family with a stable income. This comfortable living, in turn, gave Dewey future opportunities. Dewey did well academically in public schools from Burlington when he was growing up. Shortly after, he decided to enroll himself at the University of Vermont when he was barely 15 years old. When he discovered that he enjoyed studying philosophy under Henry Augustus Pearson Torrey, or also known as H.A.P. Torrey. Between his graduation from Vermont and therefore after, Dewey continued to study privately with Torrey. After years of studying, H.A.P. Torrey became a mentor that influenced him the most. Dewey placed second in his class upon graduating from the University of Vermont 4 years later. After graduation, one of Dewey's distant cousins offered him a job, and he began working as a teacher at a seminar in Oil City, Pennsylvania. 2 years later, Dewey resigned shortly after his cousin had left the seminar as the principal. Dewey returned to Vermont after leaving Pennsylvania with his cousin to begin working as a teacher at a private school. He continued to study and debate physiological work with Torrey, his former professor, in his free time. Dewey chose to pause his teaching career because of his growing interest in philosophy and psychology at Johns Hopkins. Dewey's teachers G. Stanley Hall, George Morris had the most impact and influence on him at this time at Hopkins. Dewey began working as an assistant professor at the University of Michigan in 1884 after earning his Ph.D. from Johns Hopkins. With his new position as assistant professor, he met his wife, Alice Chipman, and married in 1886. They had 6 children together throughout their marriage. Frederick, Evelyn, Morris, Lucy, Gordon, and Jane Dewey are all among them. Dewey then became a philosophy professor at the University of Minnesota when he and his family moved there in 1888 from Michigan. After only a short period of 1 year, Dewey and his family decided to go back to the University of Michigan, where Dewey continued his work and taught for the University of Chicago Philosophy Department. He stayed on at the University of Chicago until 1904 and spent 2 of those years as the School Director of Education. Thought and its subject matter, a collection of 4 articles he wrote while attending the University of Chicago, and was published in 1904 together with other works of Chicago colleagues under the collective title Studies in Logical Theory. In 1904, Dewey moved out of Chicago to attend Columbia University, working as a professor of philosophy, and continued to work with his teachers and colleagues on the side. He assumed the presidency of American Physiological Association in 1905. Dewey continued to publish more than 700 essays, 140 journals, and about 40 books. His most influential works included The Reflex Arc, Concept in Psychology, Democracy in Education, Human Nature and Conduct, The Public and Its Problems, and Experience in Nature. Most of his works focus on a particular physiological theme. Japan and China were 2 of the places Dewey and his wife visited in 1919. Wushu and Shang Moling, 2 of Dewey's former students encouraged him to visit China on his trip on behalf of Peking University. Following this decision, Dewey remained in China for the next 2 years, departing in July 1921. Dewey delivered close to 200 lectures to Chinese groups throughout these 2 years as well. However, during this time, his wife Alice died in 1927 at the age of 68. After departing Columbia in 1930, Dewey got named entitled Professor Emeritus shortly after his retirement. Then in 1934, Dewey traveled to South Africa with his daughter Jane, giving many speeches at the New Education Fellowship Conference. Additionally, he kept visiting schools, conversing with students, and lecturing other instructors and administrators. Nearly after 2 decades, John Dewey died of pneumonia on June 1st, 1952, at his home in New York City after several years of bad health. John Dewey was regarded as one of the most important philosophers of education. He played a key role in launching functionalism, as well known as American philosopher and psychologist and educational reformer, who made many contributions to education and psychology. Also, his views on patriotism and progressive education, which had a significant impact on how we view teaching and learning, are what have made him the most widely recognized. Dewey's classic article, The Reflex Arc Concept in Psychology, was published in 1896, was pivotal in the history of functionalism, or now known as social behavioralism. It would provide much of the foundation for the modern usage of the term attitude within the behavioral sciences. The article also questioned attempts to split or dissect experience into artificially segmented components. Even simple reflexes, much alone more complex behaviors, do not warrant such dissection. Furthermore, such dissection contradicts what is discovered in experience and departs from a numerical approach to psychology. The reflex concept overall challenged the prevailing model of reflex arc and proposed a dynamic sensory motor process called complete circuit coordination. Dewey argued that the reflex arc model is not misguided and a partial concept, instead of advocated for a more holistic understanding of the relationship between action and sensation. Dewey argued that the reflex arc model is not misguided and incomplete idea, but more of a comprehensive understanding of the link between action and sensation. He emphasizes the limits of simplification tactics and advocates for a more approach to the understanding of sensory process as well. According to Woody, Dewey asks his readers to consider the term reflex and asks, do we ever really consider the stimulus as a thing in itself or the response as a thing in itself? This kind of distinction is improbable outside of the well-controlled laboratory. According to Dewey, reflex is not mechanical or patchwork or disjointed parts. Instead, his encounter was a continuously ordered sequence of acts, all adapted in themselves and in the order of their sequence to reach certain objective end. Dewey's concept of instrumentalism was held that the knowledge and the truth are not absolute or fixed, but rather depend on how well they can be used and address problems in the actual world, was another key theory. This concept deviated from the conventional education methods, which frequently place on emphasis on repetitive memorization and abstract reasoning. According to Dewey, learning should be more practical so that students may use what they have learned in real-life situations. In other words, he was interested in focusing on changing the way teachers teach, moving away from the conventional lecture style method and toward a student-centered one. This is because the approach helps students develop more cross-cultural understanding and knowledge. Dewey also advocated for a hands-on project-based approach to education, which he referred to as learning by doing. He thought that rather than passively absorbing information from teachers, students learn best when they are actively involved in the learning process. This strategy placed a strong emphasis on critical thinking, problem solving, and group setting skills that are necessary for success in modern times. In addition to his theories on education, Dewey conducted research on the psychology of learning, particularly focused on the process of thinking. He proposed that thinking is influenced by the social and environmental context in which it takes place is not only a mental process. Dewey's research helped to establish the field of cognitive psychology and shape the knowledge of how individuals learn and make decisions. Overall, John Dewey was an educator, philosopher, and social reformer. Dewey was perhaps one of the most significant educational philosophers known to date and has greatly impacted education. Dewey's idea regarding social learning, which held that schools should be models of social environment and that learning occurs best in natural social setting, was clearly influenced by his views on education. His ideas impacted education in many ways since, and he believed that every student was all unique learners.